Isn't it time for the Prime Minister to simply withdraw this undemocratic bill?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, the NDP's main complaint after having not read the bill is that it tightens the rules to make sure that people cannot vote without any identification whatsoever. Now, Mr. Speaker, we know the fundamental rule of elections in democratic societies is that votes are supposed to be secret, but voters are not supposed to be secret.
An exchange in Parliament yesterday over the Elections Act reforms, the ones that are going to try and, well, tighten up some of the rules. As you heard, get rid of people being able to vouch and say, oh, yes, this is my neighbor, Billy, and he's lived in the area for a long time. He has no ID, but just trust him. J.J. McCullough, columnist and pundit for the Huffington Post and elsewhere, regular here on Sun News, joins us now to talk more about this because, J.J., you took this idea that the NDP's pushing. This is a horrible bill and horrible idea. You took them to task on this earlier today. A well-written article. What's your take on this vouching thing?
Well, the thing is, I thought that the Prime Minister's line there was pretty good because, like, the only real way that you can find a lot of problem with this bill is if you haven't read it and that if you're completely ignorant of Elections Canada policy. So when people talk about, like, ID, and there's been a lot of people that have been reacting to my column sort of weaving these elaborate situations. It's like, well, what if I'm homeless? What if I'm a student? What if I just moved in? Then I can't get ID. Well, actually, yes, you can, because Elections Canada has this enormous list of over 40 types of ID that you can have. Not even specific, like, documents of ID, but just kind of very broad types of identification that you can have. So it's like, even if you're homeless, even if you're a student, even if you just moved into your house, like all of these sort of very broad categories of people can get access to a document that can prove their identification at the polls. So like to have a problem with this, it really sort of shows that like you have to be pretty ignorant. You have to be pretty in the dark.
Maybe I'm being heartless here, but if you're homeless, where do you live? Where is your riding? I mean, well, we vote for people in specific areas. So if you're homeless and just wandering, well, are you voting for Libby Davies if you're in Vancouver? And I've seen the people show up to try and get everyone at the homeless shelter to go vote for Libby Davies in the downtown east side. Do you vote there? Do you vote in Burnaby?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point. But the fact is that Elections Canada and election law in this country is very generous when it comes to where you live, right? You can basically self-identify as living wherever you want, and you can vote on that basis. But the fact is, like, you as the voter have to have some conception of where you live. And this is part of the reason why we go through this ritual of, you know, having registered voters and looking you up on election day. And, you know, if you're self-identifying as being a resident of a place, but you go to the wrong polling place, they'll direct you somewhere else. And that's because we live in a geographically delegated parliamentary system in which you're not voting just for the sake of voting, like just as a blind ritual of checking your X or whatnot. You're voting because presumably you have a vested interest in sending a representative of your community to Ottawa. And if you are unfamiliar with where your community is, or if you have no identification to prove where your community is, well, then Elections Canada can't help you. I don't think it's a very high bar to participate in our democratic system.
No, neither do I. It's not like they're saying, oh, you've got to be a landowner. They're not going back to that. And look, let's put this in. We keep being told, oh, there's no evidence of voter fraud. I don't think we've really looked into whether there's evidence of voter fraud. I think it could happen easily. And let me give you a scenario. Middle of Ottawa, there's two ridings, one held by John Baird, the other held by Paul Dewar. Ottawa Centre, Paul Dewar's riding, it's going to stay in NDP. So what's to stop the lefties from saying, well, let's get a bunch of our guys together, and it's going to be a close race in the riding next door, and we'll just all vouch that Buddy lives with us, and then he can vote. That could happen, and everyone should be bothered by that.
No, it's very true. And what you're describing as well, like even if we're just dreaming up these scenarios in our heads, they undermine public integrity. They undermine our faith in the system. And this is something, for example, in 2010, the BC Civil Liberties Association took the government to court in the BC Supreme Court, arguing over this. You know, BC, voter ID laws are undemocratic and blah, 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 blah. And what the court said was that this is a fair burden. The burden of presenting ID is a perfectly fair burden if it helps enforce a kind of public faith in our electoral process, which is so much more important than what they described as the minor inconvenience of having to get one of these 40 classes of identification. So like when you do the cost benefit, yeah, I think that having to show your voter ID, if that makes people have more faith in our democratic system, it's worth it.
Look, we have to show ID in all different aspects of life. You know, you can be boarding a flight. I fly regularly for work now. I have to board a flight. Okay, so you're not flying for work, but maybe you're buying alcohol or cigarettes. You have to show ID, checking into a hotel. You go to the doctor in most parts of the country, you have to show your health card. You want to enter a government building here in Ottawa, you have to show your identification. These are far less important things in my mind than voting.
Well, and they demand a much, much higher standard of ID. I mean, like I said, like it is very forgiving what you can present. You can present cable bills. You can present hospital bracelets. You can present something called your employer card, whatever that is. I guess if you work at, you know, the Blockbuster, you can show your name tag or something. Like you can show anything. Like the thing too that's worth remembering too is like the standard for getting a voucher is not it's not some easy thing. It's not just grabbing Joe off the street. It's like you have to find someone who lives in your polling district, which is basically your neighborhood. He has to be a registered voter. He has to have all of the ID, and he has to be willing to accompany you in person on voting day with you to the poll station and vouch for your identity there. So the idea that that is so much easier than merely, you know, pulling through your drawer and finding an old, you know, electricity bill or something, like it just boggles the mind.
All right, we got just about a minute left. I want to ask you about this. They're calling it the death of democracy if we don't allow vouching, but I contacted Elections Ontario today. I contacted Elections Quebec. Both of them told me they don't allow this practice. About half the country lives in those two provinces. Apparently, we have dead democracy at the provincial level.
No, I mean, I just saw a message on Twitter that I think illustrated this beautifully. It was a photo of Nelson Mandela, who was campaigning, you know, when he was in charge. And he was wearing a T-shirt that said, register, get ID, vote. So even in a country like South Africa, a country with a massive, massive underclass, unlike anything in this country, they still expect this standard. It is a universal standard almost in the world. So the idea that like Canada's this uniquely regressive country that's decaying into dictatorship under the Harper government, it's ignorant. And ignorance is really the only argument that these people have.
All right, JJ, thanks for dropping by. We'll chat soon.
Thank you, sir.